Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps, and stories wake. Before tonight's tale begins, don't forget to like the video, comment where you're watching from, and tell us what kind of stories you would love to hear next. And subscribe, so you'll be here when the next story wakes. Now, let's begin. I rented the storage unit because my apartment had reached that stage of urban claustrophobia, where the walls begin to feel like quiet judges and every object in your home becomes a reminder of how slowly your life has picked up dust, and Craigslist had made the promise sound simple: cheap storage near Harbor Way. Flexible hours, first month half off. The words were direct and merciful, the sort of practical language that makes you trust strangers, and the address pulled up a faded corner lot beside an old irrigation canal where warehouses slouched like aging workers trying to remember their posture. I drove there on a Thursday evening when the sky was the color of overripe plums and the traffic lights flickered as if blinking away sleep, and the minute I turned into the lot, the world around me thinned to that uneasy quiet that lives only in industrial spaces after hours, a quiet with edges. The unit stood in long rows like teeth, numbered in stenciled paint so worn it looked like it had been weathered by more years than any rental contract should reasonably survive, and the place smelled faintly of metal, dust, and the kind of old heat that lingers even after the sun has left. I parked under a lamp that buzzed like a dying insect and followed the narrow walkway between units until I found the number the listing had given me, Unit 47, a narrow metal door with a latch that seemed both too new and too scratched to make sense. As I approached, the padlock caught the light in a way that felt accidental but intentional, like someone had placed it there only moments before I arrived. I checked my phone for the contact number, but the original listing had vanished, replaced by a generic page that made no mention of Harbor Way or first month half off. It didn't matter, the padlock was open, hanging like a question waiting for an answer, and I told myself that was just part of the welcome. People forget things, leave locks unlatched, move quickly through their days. I lifted the latch, and the door rolled up with a long, reluctant groan that seemed to echo deeper than the small space in front of me. The unit was not empty, it was arranged with a precision that felt like a mind trying to preserve itself. Old crates were stacked along the walls, labeled in neat handwriting that had faded into near invisibility: kitchen, holiday, tools, books, and a folded chair sat in the center facing the back wall as if someone had been sitting vigil there. A narrow strip of carpet lay on the concrete floor, its edges curled like a tongue, and the whole space smelled faintly of cedar and time-ripened paper. None of it looked dangerous, it just looked lived in, the way people store the parts of their lives they're not ready to decide on. My first thought was that someone had forgotten to empty their unit before the listing changed hands. My second thought was that I should call the owner and clarify. But the third thought, shy, persistent, unreasonable, was that I was meant to be there, that the open padlock wasn't a mistake so much as an invitation. I stepped inside and felt the air shift as though the space inhaled. The light behind me dimmed, and the silence thickened in a way that suggested the unit was listening. I placed my boxes near the entrance out of courtesy, telling myself I'd sort through the previous owner's things later, and that was when I noticed the chair wasn't empty. On the seat lay an object wrapped in a thin, cotton cloth, folded too carefully to be random. I lifted a corner of the cloth and saw a photograph underneath, its sepia surface catching the faint light from the single fluorescent strip overhead. The photo showed a man standing in front of the very storage unit I was in, the number 47 visible behind him, his face half-turned as if something off-camera had stolen his attention. I couldn't see his expression clearly, but the angle of his shoulders suggested tension, as though he had been caught in the act of noticing something unsettling. There was a date written on the bottom edge, March 12, 1993, and beside it a short notation: "Keep this one open." I placed the photo back on the cloth as gently as I could because touching it felt like trespassing into someone's ritual. I glanced around the unit again and noticed that the crates weren't sealed, their lids were loose, as if waiting to be opened. I don't know what possessed me to lift the first lid, curiosity, maybe, or the strange politeness we offer to objects arranged with care. Inside were dozens of keys tied together with bits of string, each labeled in the same faded handwriting: back door, shed, basement, mom's pantry. Keys to someone's life, someone's habits, someone's memory of how they moved through their world. Each key felt like a confession. I closed the crate and moved to the next. More objects, old letters, folded maps, Polaroids of people whose faces were turned away. The photographs had no blur, no sense of accidental capture, they were deliberate, taken of individuals who refused the camera outright. Something about that refusal unsettled me more than any ghost story could have. I stepped back toward the doorway then because the air had grown warmer, almost humid, as if the concrete walls had exhaled something long held. The lamp outside flickered twice, a pattern too precise to be coincidence, and the back of the unit darkened in a slow, deliberate way that had nothing to do with the fading day. Shadows moved without motion. The space behind the chair deepened like a well, as if the room had been stretched and something was listening from the far edge of the dark. I shook the thought off because you can rationalize anything when you're alone if you stack enough excuses, and I went back to unloading my boxes. But the entire time I worked, I felt a presence that was not hostile or even curious, just aware, the way a room becomes aware of someone who is rearranging it. When I placed my last box inside and stepped back, the door suddenly shuttered behind me, rolling down halfway before stopping with a metallic cough. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even been close. The air thickened again, and I felt that same unreasonable sensation of being evaluated. I spent the next few days returning to the unit because leaving it felt like closing a door on a question that deserved an ending. Each time, the crate seemed to have shifted slightly, not moved far, but angled differently, as though someone had been sorting through them and placing them back with care. The chair moved too, turning fractionally each visit like someone had sat in it and listened to the echo of my footsteps in their absence. The photograph on the seat changed orientation each time. Once, the date was facing up, another day, the handwritten note stared back at me, next time, the entire picture had been turned over as if the man in the image didn't want to be looked at. One night, I found the cloth on the chair folded into a neat square and the photograph set upright against the backrest like a portrait displayed at a memorial. The chair itself had been angled toward the entrance, as if awaiting my arrival. The fluorescent strip overhead buzzed louder than usual, a lulling, hypnotic sound that almost masked the soft scrape coming from deeper in the unit. It was faint, rhythmic, like someone dragging a fingertip slowly along the concrete wall. Not scratching. Not tapping. Just tracing. I froze because the sound carried intention, not accident, and rooms that begin tracing their own edges are not rooms you walk into carelessly. I said aloud, "Is someone here?" because silence makes you bold in stupid ways. The tracing didn't stop. It moved slightly, a few inches toward the left wall, then downward. I stepped back out into the walkway, my body insisting on distance while my mind insisted on explanation. I turned to pull the door shut, but the metal grated in protest, resisting the closure like something inside wanted to keep the air flowing. I forced it down anyway because fear is sometimes just discipline applied quickly, and I locked it with the bright new padlock the unit had come with. As I walked back to the car, the lamp above me flickered in a slow pulse, long, short. A pattern that felt like speech. I should have cancelled the contract. I should have taken my boxes out and left the unit to whatever legacy had shaped it. But curiosity anchors you more deeply than obligation. The next evening, I returned. The padlock hung open again. The door was rolled up a quarter of the way. The crates were arranged in a near-perfect semicircle around the chair, all facing inward as if attending a lecture. And on the chair, in place of the cloth, lay a small object, a key. Not one from the crate, not one I recognized. It was clean, silver, almost new, with a single word engraved on its bow, "Inside." I touched it because humanity is a species that can't leave a labeled object alone, and the moment my fingers closed around it, the temperature in the unit dropped a sharp few degrees. The air tasted like cold iron. I lifted the key, turned it over, felt its weight, and when I reached for the first crate to place it gently inside, the tracing sound began again, this time louder, more deliberate. I turned toward the back wall. The shadows there were deeper than earlier visits, arranged in a way that suggested layered movement. The tracing shifted upward, along the seam where the wall met the ceiling, and then down toward the floor with a patient rhythm, as though someone were drawing the outline of a doorway invisible to the eye. The crates behind me vibrated faintly, their lids rattling soft warnings that felt like breath caught in wooden boxes. I backed out again because fear teaches you choreography. The key fell from my hand and hit the concrete with a metallic ring that sounded like a bell signaling the start of something. The shadows at the back of the unit rippled, contracting and expanding as if something behind them had leaned forward slightly. The fluorescent light flickered, long, short, long, longer. A pattern, not random, not sporadic. And in the sweep of that flicker, for a heartbeat, I saw the faint outline of the man from the photograph, standing where the wall should have been, his shoulders angled away as before, as if interrupted mid-turn by something behind him. His edges flickered like heat distortions, then the light steadied, and he was gone. I shut the unit and left the key where it fell because touching it again felt like acknowledging an invitation. I drove home with the kind of concentration people use when they want to pretend the rearview mirror is not its own nervous oracle. But the presence didn't stay in the unit. It followed, not in footsteps, not in sightings, but in the quiet organization of things in my home. The next morning, the boxes I'd planned to unpack later were already open, their contents sorted neatly by size and type, just like the crates in the unit. An old photograph of me from years ago, a picture I hadn't taken or seen in ages, lay on the table with a handwritten note beneath it in the same faded handwriting as the crates, "Keep this one open." And that was when I understood that the presence wasn't confined to Unit 47. It had chosen me the moment I stepped inside with boxes and breath, and what lived there wasn't guarding belongings, it was curating them, tending them, making sure nothing stayed closed too long. That cautionary note wasn't for the unit, it was for the memories inside me. The tracing I heard in the concrete wasn't mapping its own space, it was mapping mine. Now, some nights, when the apartment goes quiet and the hallway lights dim into that soft amber glow that buildings adopt when they pretend to sleep, I hear the familiar tracing along my bedroom wall. A slow outline of a square, then a line, then a curve. As if drawing a doorway in the drywall, patient and steady, waiting for me to acknowledge whatever boundary it's asking to cross. The key from the unit never reappeared, but some mornings I wake to find new keys on my table, old ones, marked with labels I don't recognize, tied with twine that smells faintly of cedar and paper. I don't touch them, I know they're not for doors in this building. I still have the storage unit contract. I still pay the monthly fee because ending it feels like closing something that has no business being closed. I don't visit anymore, not physically. But in the quiet hours between sleep and waking, I see the crates in my dreams, lids lifting one by one, their contents arranged not for me to examine but for something inside them to remember. And every dream ends the same way. I'm standing in the doorway of Unit 47, the padlock open, the door rolled halfway up, and the man from the photograph is beside me, half-turned, waiting for me to look where he's looking. But I never do. Because I know that whatever he saw in 1993 is still there, still tracing its patient lines, still waiting for me to learn the shape of a door that doesn't belong to this world. I took the Craigslist delivery job on a night that felt like it had been left out too long, a night that had grown stale at the edges the way bread does when you forget it on the counter. My apartment was one of those places that never quite settled into being home, it always felt borrowed, as if the walls were waiting for someone else to claim them, and I'd been sitting too long in a silence that felt dense enough to pick up and ring out. The lamplight had gone that sickly yellow it gets when a bulb is nearing its final hours, and the fan in the corner kept cycling between two speeds like it couldn't commit to either exhaustion or effort. I wasn't looking for work exactly, I was looking for anything that made me feel less like furniture. Craigslist was the usual graveyard of half-hearted offers and vague threats disguised as opportunities, and I had already scrolled past mattress giveaways, unreliable gigs, and people begging for creative collaborators, for passion projects that would totally blow up soon. And then the listing appeared like something nudged to the top by a hand I couldn't see: night delivery, 1 parcel, cash on completion, must have car, no questions, immediate pickup. There was no exclamation mark, nothing exaggerated, none of the overeager desperation that always gives away scams. It read like instructions left on a kitchen counter, like something someone had been meaning to ask you personally. I should have closed the tab or at least let it sit long enough for rationality to sober up, but the part of me that had been quiet for weeks stirred suddenly, the part that wanted to feel useful even if usefulness was the final excuse people gave before they wandered into bad decisions, I replied. The message was barely sent when a response came back, no greeting, no name, just an address and the line, "Come now, bring ID." It wasn't a request, it was a sentence. I grabbed my keys before I talked myself out of it. The hallway outside my apartment was colder than it should have been, the kind of cold that doesn't belong to weather but to rooms that haven't been bothered in a while. By the time I reached my car, the city had dipped into that strange in-between hour where everything feels suspended, where even streetlights seem tired of doing their job and the distant hum of traffic becomes one long, disinterested exhale. I drove toward the industrial belt, the part of town that never looks fully awake even at noon and seems to dream in rust and dust after dark. The pickup address led me to a squat warehouse tucked between two abandoned freight offices. A single exterior lamp flickered above the loading dock, buzzing like a trapped insect. Under the sickly cone of light stood a man in a coat 2 sizes too big, the shoulders sagging as if tired of holding him up. His posture was patient in the way trees are patient, still, but not quite calm. His eyes followed me as I walked over, not with suspicion but with a kind of resignation, as though he had been waiting for someone like me and no longer had the energy to imagine someone better. "You're the driver," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, and he bent to pick up a small parcel from the concrete. It was wrapped in brown paper like something mailed in the 60s, the twine knotted with a deliberate neatness that felt more ritual than practical. When he placed it in my hands, I felt warmth radiating through the paper, not electronic warmth, not thermodynamic warmth, but something closer to the warmth of breath or blood. My chest tightened in a quiet, instinctive way. "You'll follow the pin," he said. "If it moves, follow it, don't stop long, don't open it, and if it gets warm, don't worry, that's normal." I wanted to ask how something unopened could warm itself, but he had already turned away in that slow, drained manner of someone who has completed the one task required of him for the night. So I walked back to my car, cradling the parcel like something fragile or recently alive. I put it on the passenger seat, and the moment I shut the door, my phone lit up, not with a notification but with a map already open, a blue pin blinking faintly on a street I'd never heard of. It wasn't even a map app one used. The route line drew itself as I watched, like someone tracing a finger across the screen from the other side. My breath caught in my throat, but I told myself, as people always do in these moments, that technology glitches, GPS jumps, phones get weird. Anything is better than admitting the world just leaned closer to look at you. The first stop took me past the rail yard, where disused train cars sat like rib cages in the dark, their metal sides echoing the faint groans of cooling steel. The pin pulsed on a narrow alley behind an old freight office. I slowed the car, expecting someone to emerge from the shadows, but the alley was silent in a thick, padded way that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. I waited a few seconds too long and the pin shifted, 3 blocks east. When I turned out of the alley, it shifted again, 5 blocks south, then west, then north. It was guiding me like something running ahead and checking to see if I kept up. The parcel warmed beside me. Not burning, not alarming, just warm like a hand resting quietly on your arm to remind you it's there. I drove through neighborhoods that seemed to fold into each other, streets I'd never seen despite living in the city for years. A fog rolled in near the river district, thick and deliberate, the kind that behaves less like weather and more like the slow breath of something immense. My headlights cut shallow tunnels through it, barely touching the buildings that leaned close. Like they were whispering across narrow streets. The pin hovered at the riverbank for a moment before darting toward a road lined with trees that had grown wild and hungry, their branches angling like old hands reaching for anything warm. The parcel shifted gently on the seat, not sliding with the car's movement but adjusting itself, a small, almost polite movement. I gripped the steering wheel harder. "Just a delivery," I muttered, "just a job." But the night didn't feel convinced. When the pin finally settled at a gas station that looked long abandoned, I pulled in slowly. The pumps were tilted, their hoses limp like dead snakes. The store windows reflected nothing. Even the insects avoided the place. I waited for someone to appear, someone to trade the parcel for cash or words or anything human, but the GPS chimed again. The pin jumped backward, retracing my entire route. Something in me laughed, not because it was funny, because the alternative was letting the dread rise like water in a closed room. Of course, I said, of course we go back. I drove the same streets, but everything looked altered on the return trip. The fog felt heavier. The trees seemed to lean in more. Even the buildings seemed to have exhaled something they had been holding in earlier. When the pin finally settled, not at the warehouse I had started at but at a smaller structure tucked behind it, a building I would swear hadn't existed an hour earlier, I felt the air around me shift, tightening like a held breath. The building's door was new, too new, like it had been installed recently into a wall that had forgotten what fresh would look like. I held the parcel, feeling the heat now not as warmth but as presence, something with a quiet pulse. I approached the door slowly. The twine loosened, by itself. Just a soft unwinding, the paper edges lifting like something inside had sighed with relief. A faint warmth drifted out as the paper relaxed against my fingers. I set it down, I didn't open it. The deal had never asked for that. For a moment nothing happened. Then the door, without opening, seemed to lean back, as though someone behind it had been listening and stepped away. When I reached my car again, the seat beside me looked strangely empty, like the impression of absence was heavier than the presence had been. I drove home in a silence that seemed newly made. For days afterward, nothing happened. I let myself believe I was done. That the job had been strange, maybe illegal, maybe unwise, but over. I slept better, I walked lighter, I told myself the warmth had been trapped air or old wiring or my imagination trying to earn extra credit. I even forgot about the man's coat, the fog, the parcel relaxing like a breathing thing. Until the 10th night. At 3:14 a.m., my car alarm chirped, not the full alarm, just 3 short, trembling beeps, like it had been nudged awake gently. I went outside expecting a stray dog or a drunk leaning on the bumper, but nothing moved on the street, not even air. The driver's door was unlocked. I didn't want to open it, my hand did anyway. The interior smelled faintly of warm paper, the exact scent from the night of the delivery. The dashboard lights flickered in the same hesitant pattern I'd seen at the warehouse. But the thing that pulled breath from my chest wasn't the smell or the lights. It was the passenger seat. The fabric was warm, fresh warm. As though someone had just been sitting there, weight shifting, body leaned into the cushion. And on the seat, pressed faintly into the fabric, 2 parallel indentations, thin and unmistakable, exactly the width of twine. As though something wrapped had rested there again, or visited to remind itself. Which way home used to be. For a long time I didn't move. I stood there with the passenger door open, staring at those faint twine-shaped impressions in the seat like they were trying to teach me a new alphabet, one written in absences and warmth instead of ink. The air in the car felt heavier the longer I breathed it, as if something had only recently left and the space hadn't had time to cool its outline. I touched the seat with the back of my fingers, telling myself this was just thermal retention, that fabric holds heat in strange ways, that maybe sunlight from earlier had trapped itself in the stitching. But the night had been cold, the car had been locked, and my mind wasn't cooperative enough to conjure harmless explanations. The warmth wasn't fading either, it felt like it was waiting, like it wanted to be acknowledged before it decided what to do next. I stepped back, shut the door gently, and leaned against the hood of the car. The street stretched empty in both directions, the kind of emptiness that feels deliberate, like the world had politely excused itself to give me privacy with something I wasn't meant to understand. Nothing moved, no windows lit up, no engines passed, not even the usual far-off bark from a neighbor's restless dog. The night felt like a held breath, and I stood in the center of it with the realization settling slowly through me that whatever I had delivered hadn't really stayed delivered. You don't leave warmth behind unless you expect to return to it. When I finally went back upstairs, the apartment looked exactly as I had left it, unbothered, faintly tired, the lamp flickering like it was still deciding whether to commit to existence. I sat on the floor instead of the couch and stared at the door as though expecting a knock. Nothing happened, but sleep stayed far from me, hovering somewhere out of reach, and the quiet felt like a second presence in the room. I tried to convince myself it was a one-time incident. A strange job, a stranger after effect. Cities are full of unsolved evenings. But the next morning, the car felt wrong. Not dangerous, not violated, just inhabited. The driver's seat had shifted back half an inch. My radio presets were untouched, my glove compartment was closed. But there, on the center console, sat a small crease of brown paper fiber, thin and curled like the flake of something that had been wrapped too tightly for too long. I picked it up carefully. It was warm, warm in the same slow, patient way the parcel had been on the night I took the job. I dropped it without meaning to, and it fell silently onto the seat as though expecting the place. That was the moment I realized I hadn't delivered an object, I'd delivered a path. Whatever had been wrapped in the parcel hadn't been meant for a building behind a warehouse, it had been meant to travel, and I had been the first route. For the next 2 days, subtle things started happening, small oddities that didn't scream for attention but whispered for it, nudging at the edges of my routines. The car key in my pocket felt slightly warm whenever I passed the vehicle, as if responding to a presence inside. My phone's map app kept opening on its own, showing blank pins and places I hadn't visited. Once, when I walked past the car at night, the interior light flickered on for half a second even though the doors were locked. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at the vehicle as though it had exhaled. The light clicked off again, leaving the cabin in its familiar stillness. I didn't open the door, I couldn't bring myself to. But the next morning, the seat was warm again. Not hot, not alarming, just warm, like someone had sat there briefly, thinking, maybe watching the street the way tired people watch the world when they're between destinations. I checked the locks 3 times, they were still engaged. That I hadn't imagined anything. By the 4th day, the map pins became more insistent. Every few hours, my phone vibrated with a notification that wasn't from any installed app. Just a plain white banner with a blinking blue dot centered on a stretch of road I'd never driven. The first location was in the hills north of the city, a narrow strip of highway where rock cliffs rose like broken teeth on either side. The second was in a suburban cul-de-sac where identical houses looked like polite replicas of each other. The third was deep near the freight yards again, circling, looping, tracing the same paths I had driven the night of the job but in different sequences, like something was searching for the right order. Each pin had a small note under it. A single word, return. I tried to ignore them, I deleted the alerts, I turned off my phone. But the pins kept coming back, appearing even on the black screen of a powered-down device like they had learned to bypass something essential in the circuitry. And the car grew warmer. Day by day, the passenger seat held heat longer. The faint twine-shaped impressions deepened. And one night, when I unlocked the door to grab something from the back, the seatbelt on the passenger side was pulled halfway out, as though someone had begun to buckle themselves in before deciding to wait. That was when dread fully replaced denial. I sat behind the wheel and whispered into the empty cabin, "What do you want?" The radio crackled, not with music, not with static, with breath, just one long, slow exhale. Not human exactly, but not entirely other. And then my phone lit up again, a new pin. No distance given, just one word, home. I didn't recognize the address. But the coordinates led to a neighborhood near the edge of the city where old houses sagged into themselves like they were tired of standing, streets bending under decades of unplanned growth. The closer I got, the more the air inside the car warmed, not uncomfortably, but intimately. Like shared body heat in a small room. I drove slowly, heart tight, hands tense on the steering wheel, until I reached a narrow lane lined with houses that seemed carved out of gloom. The pin pulsed softly over a small, 2-story house with peeling paint and a tree in the front yard that looked starved of light. The passenger seat grew warmer. Not urging, not threatening, just waiting. I understood then, I hadn't delivered something. I had brought something home, to a place it remembered faintly, maybe the way people remember the smell of a childhood room or the echo of laughter in a hallway that no longer exists. I parked, I didn't turn off the engine. The house felt empty, but not abandoned. It carried the stillness of a place holding its breath for someone who hasn't visited in years. The porch boards sagged under old weight, the windows were dull with dust. I whispered, "Is this where you lived?" The radio clicked once. A yes, or something close enough. I got out slowly, leaving the passenger door open. The air outside was cold enough to bite. The air inside the car was warm enough to fog the windows. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the warmth shifted. The twine-shaped indentations deepened. The seatbelt unspooled the rest of the way, smooth, deliberate, quiet. And the passenger door closed gently. Not slammed, closed. As though someone had stepped out. I didn't see anything leave the car. But I felt it, the same soft pressure of presence I had felt through the parcel paper. The same warmth that had rested beside me mile after mile. It drifted up the walkway, brushing past me like a faint, warm breeze. The porch light flickered on for the first time in what looked like years. I watched the front door creak inward, slow and grateful, as though welcoming someone who had been gone too long. There was no figure, no shadow, no sound. Just the feeling of something finally stepping into its own absence. The porch light dimmed, the door eased shut, a quiet settled over the street so natural that it felt like nothing strange had ever happened. I stood there for a long time. The car behind me cooled, the seat warmth faded, the twine impressions slowly rose back into the fabric until they were gone completely, the radio stayed silent. When I finally got back behind the wheel, the GPS map was blank, no pins, no routes, no requests. The job was done, truly done. But when I drove home that night, I kept glancing at the passenger seat. Half expecting to see warmth blooming again. Half expecting someone, something. To drift back for one last ride, it never did. Though sometimes, late at night. When the street outside my apartment goes unusually quiet, I swear I hear the faint click of a seatbelt pulling itself into place somewhere far away, as if remembering the shape of a passenger who once needed a way home. I listed the old camera because the apartment had started to feel like a collection of abandoned decisions, and selling something that still worked felt less like loss and more like pruning. The camera had been with me through better pockets of time, when days were long and I thought composition might save me, but lately it sat on the shelf in half-shadow collecting dust, and the idea of turning it into something practical, cash for groceries, a small emergency, suddenly felt responsible. I wrote the listing with the same brief, apologetic tone I use when I text people I barely know, model, condition, a few photos taken under the kitchen bulb that makes everything look warmer than it should, price negotiable but fair. The responses started the way they always do, questions about scratches, requests for more photos, someone trying to haggle a discount, but then one message came in that settled into the thread like a single, confident sentence and made the rest of the replies glow with their nervousness by comparison. I'll take it, 8 p.m. I'll know you. No, hi, no name, no, are you available? It was an assertion that read as a fact and not a request, and for reasons I couldn't name at the time it calmed me. Maybe because I was tired of haggling, maybe because I wanted to imagine a quick exchange and then sleep. I texted back with the address before I thought it through, the small box of characters feeling ridiculously inadequate for giving someone permission to cross my threshold, and I watched the message send like a minor surrender. The apartment seemed to shift a degree when I hit send, like air repositioned itself inside the rooms as if to make room for someone who already had plans. I spent the hour before 8 doing the tasks people do to feel normal while waiting, cleaning the lens until it shone, checking the battery compartment and the strap, making tea, setting the camera in its case on the kitchen counter like a small consecration. The building hummed with its usual late weekday noises, pipes, a neighbor's distant laugh, a refrigerator cycling, but all of it felt pushed back a little, as if the world had softened the edges so an arrival could be noticed properly. At 7:58 my skin went prickly in a way I've learned to trust. It's the same prickling that tells you the weather is about to turn, or that someone is watching you from a place you hadn't looked. When the doorbell rang at exactly 8, it was a single, delicate chime that did not demand attention so much as announce presence. I am here. I opened the door expecting a silhouette holding a phone, some young person used to internet meetups, but the porch was empty except for the lamp that kept a small circle of light steady. The street looked ordinary and almost docile, cars snoozing, a single dog pacing the next block, and for a stupid second I thought maybe I'd dreamt the whole thing. Then I heard my name from the path, soft, casual, not shouted, a voice that sounded like someone making a note of me in passing. I called out because that is the reflex. Someone's voice at night makes the world require you to respond, and the bushes answered with a faint scuff of movement and then silence. I closed the door slowly because closing it felt like making a private decision public, and as the lock clicked the apartment felt different. The air had been rearranged, and I could sense it like a new furniture placement you haven't yet learned to navigate. My phone vibrated with the buyer's precise message immediately after, "Don't shut it." I stood there with my hand still on the knob because the sentence felt less like an instruction and more like a curiosity. It assumed an intimacy that unsettled me. I left the door ajar a crack because the idea of defying a stranger felt like bad manners and because the alternative was to be rude to someone who had already committed to a time. That foolish courtesy was the hinge on which the rest of the evening swung. The entire apartment filled slowly with a peculiar attention, the sort that makes light seem aware of itself. The lamp glowed with an almost smug steadiness. I set the camera on the table and tried to be practical. I told myself this was a non-story, a buyer who preferred quiet transactions. Then the message came again, inside, no details, no explanation. The word landed like someone closing a distance in the room without footsteps. There are many ways to feel unsafe, and some of the worst begin with overstretched politeness. I moved through the apartment checking the obvious places, behind the couch, in the kitchen alcove, the bedroom door, the bathroom, and in each I found ordinary things arranged in ordinary ways. But the ordinary had been layered with something else, a small rearrangement, the kind that looks deliberate only if you know what to watch for. The coat that had hung a certain way on the chair had a sleeve folded differently. The cushion on the couch faced another direction. A single photograph on the wall had been tilted by the width of a fingernail. These aren't dramatic signs, nothing you would show the police, but they stack inside you until they become proof. My phone buzzed. "Don't be afraid, you invited me." The sentence was a fact, not a plea. I didn't remember inviting anyone. My invite had been nothing more than the address I texted. But invitation can be a wider category than explicit permission. Sometimes it's an ignorance that is taken advantage of, a door left unlocked because the owner forgot to consider what might slip through. I watched the closet door in the hallway, the one that always stuck, as if expecting it to do something. It sat closed, ordinary, humdrum, and yet I felt the pressure of a presence just beyond sight like someone waiting their turn at a crowded event. It clicked, a small, almost thoughtful sound, and the coats inside shifted the way they do when someone passes by them. I did not open it at first because opening felt like participation. Instead I prayed a small, private prayer, not to God but to the animal part of me that still knows how to survive. "Don't let this be dangerous, if it is, run." The apartment answered in a slow, civil way. The porch light outside flickered, 3 long pulses, 2 short, 1 long, a pattern that could have been electrical but which read to me like a practiced code. The camera case moved by a fraction on the table as if nudged. The note of the encounter had changed from a transaction to an arrangement. At some point I texted my sister a casual line, "Selling camera tonight," and watched the 3 dots of a reply appear and then vanish without delivering anything. It felt obscene to ask for help over a text when something in the room was patient and undeniably domestic. I took the cautious step of speaking aloud. "If you're here for the camera, you can have it. I just want to know who I'm talking to." The reply force was soft but close. "I don't want the camera. I'm looking for where you keep things." The sentence reframed the whole evening. The focus had slid from object exchange to the architecture of my life. It occurred to me then, in a way that felt like a physical reality arriving late, that some buyers aren't interested in your things so much as in their locations, the secret places you tuck receipts, the drawers you use when you don't expect company. The linen closet you never lock because who would? I realized with a cold clarity that this person's aim was not acquisition but acquaintance. It wanted to know my rooms as a map of possibility. After that the apartment behaved like a space with 2 tenants. The small signs multiplied in gentle, infuriating ways. A spoon moved to the left, my shoes aligned to the door rather than scattered, a paperback I'd left face down was turned face up. Not theft, not vandalism, an insistence on neatness. The closet gave itself small, private sounds at odd hours, and once during the night I woke to the sound of fabric whispering, like someone running their hands over coats. The next morning the camera lay on the couch exactly where someone with time would place it, angled like a thing being inspected, and beside it a single index card in handwriting I recognized, my handwriting, but with words I didn't remember writing. Let it be tidy. I touched the card and for a second the edges felt alive, as if the ink had recently dried. I could have thrown the card away, could have catalogued the events into rational explanations, could have decided the simplest act was to call the police and have someone come over and find nothing and explain it all away. But the police are trained to see crime, and what had happened felt like a domestic etiquette of a different order, not malice but claim. Calling would make it legal, leaving it unremarked made it intimate. A week passed and the presence did not escalate into violence. It folded itself into chores and small interventions that made the apartment operate on someone else's sense of order. Sometimes the mail was arranged by date, sometimes the kettle was filled, sometimes an old sweater I'd lost weeks before reappeared tucked neatly beneath the cushion. There were kindnesses, the kind that feel like obligations, a cup left half-finished, the curtains pulled just so, the light dimmed at a certain hour. But alongside the kindness there were small deft removals, a memory here, a phrasing there. I'd catch myself misplacing a name, a detail that used to be easy, my old neighbor's dog's name gliding out of reach for a day until I hummed it back into being. Once, the lyrics to a song I loved thinned at the edges until I had to hum the tune to anchor the words back where they belonged. It was as though the apartment, or what lived in it, kept an accounting book and decided some payments were due for the shelter it offered. The more I left, the more it rearranged. Presents had a price and I was apparently the supplier of the currency. I started leaving small offerings because the ledger was not going to balance itself, and because the alternative, doing nothing, felt like an abandonment of an arrangement I had silently accepted. A cup of tea on the end table, a folded blanket, the camera returned to its case with the strap wound in the same careful loop the buyer seemed to prefer. Each morning the offerings were acknowledged in ways that did not need headlines. The tea cooled, a gentle indentation on the couch where a hand might have rested, the blanket folded differently but folded with an attention I came to respect. There persisted a softness in those gestures, like someone learning to live around you instead of supplanting you. That did not make the loss of small facts less sharp. I still misremembered things, but the misremembering felt less like a theft than like a relocation. Somewhere in the margins of my mind lines were being erased and redrawn in the hand of the house. There were other perturbations that felt stranger still. Once I found a photograph tucked under the couch skirt, a sepia print of a backyard I faintly recognized but could not place, its edges browned as if sun had lived there for years. On the back was a name in my handwriting I didn't remember making, and under that, another line in a tight script that was not mine: "You keep watch." I tried to remember when I had written it, I could not, and the not knowing slowly became one of the facts I began to accept. A neighbor, the woman from 2 floors down who traded sugar and a few words, mentioned casually that the house I'd collected the camera from had histories, and that sometimes things choose the wrong person to get one over. She said it like someone explaining weather, part observation, part rumor, and then offered, "If it sits with you now." She didn't ask why or how, she spoke like a person who had seen the pattern before and had decided the easiest kindness was to not pry. That tacit agreement from the building's other residents somehow made the presence less of a menace and more of an arrangement. Months slide strangely when your life is shared with something that prefers a different timekeeping. The apartment acquired small rituals. The closet would open an inch at 3:14 a.m. and sit so, the glow from within an amber patience. A slow hum would sometimes come from inside the walls, a cadence that resembled humming someone might do when they remember a line of a song. Objects I had assumed lost resurfaced in improbable places. I learned to live with the subtle choreography because the presence, if nothing else, practiced a respectful cohabitation. It never demanded loud things. It never forced open the door to the bedroom. It learned my routes and walked politely around them. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would wake and feel the sense of being observed the way a person feels when their photograph is being taken without their consent, noticed, framed. More than once I suspected the presence watched me not with hunger but with boredom and the desire to be useful. And still, something about the exchange left me unsettled. I noticed my own handwriting changing, loops tightening, the flourish on the Y shortened, as if the place asked me to be neater too. Names slipped sometimes, as though memory itself was being parceled out, not stolen but rationed. The more I tried to anchor myself with lists and photos, the more I realized the ledger didn't like to be confronted by its own records. It rearranged memory in quiet ways. An appointment I planned would fog from my head until I'd have to call someone else to verify it. The day of a friend's birthday would thin away until the person calling me to ask whether I remembered would be the one keeping track. It's petty, these small erosions, and yet they mount like unpaid bills until they echo. I found myself writing names on post-its and tucking them into drawers, humming songs aloud in the apartment to repopulate the words, performing small acts of defiance I told myself were practical. Once, incapable of ignoring the sensation that the closet and whatever occupied it had a wider appetite, I opened the door late at night after making tea and bringing a second cup. If the presence wanted witness, I would witness and make of it something like company. The interior was as it always had been, coats, shoes, stacked boxes, but the amber light glowed like a hearth and the air smelled faintly of old paper and sea salt, a combination I couldn't reconcile with my city apartment. On the floor lay a small object, a metallic key tied with yellow twine and a tag with a single word, remember. I picked it up with fingers that trembled because the object felt like a relic, precise and indisputable. Holding it, I understood in some little animal part of my brain that there are exchanges you make that bind you more than money ever could. The key seemed to ask that I hold it as witness. I left it on the table where it could be seen and, oddly, each morning thereafter it moved an inch closer to the closet. It was as if the presence wanted something visible to be acknowledged. I could have moved out, I could have cleared my things and left the apartment to whatever entity preferred that tidy arrangement. But displacement felt like surrender, and it felt selfish. Whoever or whatever was here had, thus far, not hurt me. It had rearranged my life, yes, and eaten small, non-essential facts, but it had also folded my oddities into a gentle domesticity. I began to think of the presence as something like a tenant who pays their rent in small memory adjustments. There is a human inclination toward bargains when loneliness is a variable. We take companionship even when the price is ridiculous. So I stayed and adapted, learning to write important things twice, to put names in my phone with reminders set for 24 hours earlier than necessary, to keep lists both physical and mental. I created redundancies, a system of anchors so the presence's ledger would have less to take. And because the world is riddled with ritual, the woman who had given me the camera came by one afternoon with a casserole and a look like a question folded into a sentence. She didn't ask sharp things, she simply said, "You're doing well. Thank you for keeping them tidy." Her hands were steady as she patted the arm of the couch, the way people pat the shoulder of someone they both know and won't speak about. I wanted to ask who they were. I wanted to wrench out the ledger and read the entries like a bank statement, what had been exchanged, what had been returned, what was still owed. But the ledger, I had learned, was not meant to be read by those who hadn't earned its marks. Some things keep to themselves. Some mercies are bureaucratic. Time blurred into a rhythm I could live with. There were windows of clarity, afternoons when I would take the camera down and walk outside and take pictures of the city's unkind angles and the shopfronts at dusk. And those outings felt like reclaiming a part of myself. Sometimes the presence seemed curious about these small acts, as though it enjoyed being included in someone else's life. Once I returned to find a photograph on the table of a street I'd walked earlier that day, printed on thin paper and set upright as if someone had wanted the memory to be less fragile. My name was on the back in a hand that was mine but written slower, like someone imitating familiarity, "Keep watch." It was a request, a command, and a comfort. Not everyone will understand this compromise. Few things that exist in the gray areas of consent are easy to explain. The presence never became malevolent in the way stories warn of. It did not break bones, it did not scatter glass, it did not turn the living against me. It was, at its worst, quietly acquisitive. At its best, oddly solicitous. It rearranged but also looked after. It taught me the worth of small acts of attention and their costs. I learned to tend the apartment like a place that will, in turn, tend the ledger. I found that speaking names aloud at night anchored them in my mind better than worrying about forgetting. I learned to leave the porch light off unless I was going out, because the pattern of flicker seemed to be a language I had no vocabulary for. I learned to keep the key on the table where I could see it, the one the presence moved toward, because seeing the object felt like recording it, witness as payment. Sometimes late, when the city's noise folds into the hush that makes apartments feel like small boats at sea, I will sit on the couch with the camera on my knee and listen for the subtle domestic sounds, a coat shuffled, a cup set back down, paper smoothed. I speak aloud small, obvious facts as if performing an oath: your mother's birthday, a friend's name, the number of the bar I go to, the line from a song. The presence answers not with language so much as with behavior: my mail sorted, the kettle filled. It is not the bargain I would have written for myself when I was younger and idealistic, not the tidy contract with a clean signature, but it is a contract nonetheless. I have learned to live within it and to keep the receipts. If you sell something on the internet and a buyer says casually that they know you, take that meaning seriously. People say they know things when they want to claim ease. Sometimes ease is harmless, sometimes ease is a mapping. I live with the mapping now. I no longer list cameras, I no longer leave my door ajar for convenience. I leave a chair by the closet sometimes, and a cup on the table, and I try to be precise with the names I say aloud so the ledger has less freedom to interpret them. When the porch light pulses its slow code, I listen and answer softly into the room, because some bargains require demonstration of memory and because, in the end, I accepted this small tenancy the night I handed my address to a stranger and the strange used that permission like a key. I answered the free couch listing because my apartment had been losing shape around the edges, and because the idea of something that cost nothing felt like a small mercy, and when you're alone in a city that eats money for breakfast, even the promise of a sagging leather couch that someone wants gone feels like a small victory. The listing was short and polite, no pictures, no story, just an address and the line, free to pick up, next to the old elm lot. It sounded ordinary in the way that dangerous things do, it sounded like someone trying to be practical. I drove there late on a Tuesday when the streets had thinned out and the sky was a pale sheet over the neighborhood. The address led me down a narrow row of houses that squeezed the street to one lane, each porch light a small guarded island. Near the elm lot, an empty patch of grass between two blocks where kids used to play and now only stray newspapers and the occasional shopping cart lived, the house stood with its blinds down and a for sale sign that had been half painted over. A single bulb glowed inside the doorway, a domestic patience. I parked on the curb and let the engine idle. There was no hurry, things that are free often require time to accept the trade. I rang the bell out of politeness because that's what people do when they agree to meet strangers about furniture, and the door opened not immediately but after a long, careful pause that felt like the house was making up its mind about me. A woman stood there, middle-aged, hair pinned back hard, eyes the particular gray of people who have spent months learning to be small in public. She looked at me the way someone might inspect an object being returned, with a mix of calculation and relief. "You here for the couch?" she said, and her voice was the clear, controlled voice of someone who'd been through too many transactions to imagine them as anything but business. I said yes. She stepped aside without inviting me inside. And the living room beyond her looked dim and narrow, the kind of room that had made a couch its life support for decades. The couch sat against the far wall like an island, its cushions indented the way old grief leaves impressions in things. It looked perfectly ordinary until I noticed the blanket folded on the center cushion and the single pair of glasses perched on its arm, as if they had been set down to read and never lifted again. There was a smell, old tea and something like damp paper, that placed the room firmly in an older chronology than my own. She began to talk because that is what polite people do when handing off things that meant something else to them. "It's been in the family a long time," she said. "He used to sit right there." She waved at what I guessed was a photograph on the mantel, though the glare kept it private. I asked the balancing question, was it still comfortable, and she laughed a little, the sound rusty and worried. "Comfort is relative," she said. "It's sturdy, it's seen a lot." When she moved, the blanket twitched as if someone had just shifted beneath it for a second and then stilled. I heard the shift without meaning to, and I stopped. A small, unreasonable part of me wanted to back out and say my car had a flat or that I'd suddenly remembered a meeting, but I kept breathing because I had driven too far to stage an exit. We negotiated the particulars, the couch lift, the time, and she said she'd help me carry it to the curb. That sounded like kindness and confirmation both, so I nodded and stepped closer. The couch smelled of the house more than of fabric, it smelled of the sort of domestic routine that layers itself like sediment. When I tugged at the cushion it gave with that patient, forgiving resistance an old piece of furniture offers, and for a moment everything felt practical and almost tender. Then the blanket slipped again, the way a blanket slips when a leg moves underneath. And the glasses tipped as if someone had reached for them and changed their mind. I might have dismissed it as the nervousness of a woman watching a stranger handle the family's furnishing, but the room held a secondary rhythm now, an extra measure beneath the normal sound of voices and floorboards. I felt watched, not from above but from beside the cushions, a nearness that didn't belong to me. The woman saw me pause and smiled the smile people show when they want to be reassured they are doing the right thing. "He liked company," she said, and the sentence hung in the air like an explanation that wasn't quite finished, even in the quiet times. We lifted the couch together in a practiced, awkward ballet. The first half came outside easily, the frame was light for its size. We maneuvered it through the hallway and out the front door onto the patch of sidewalk. The street smelled like old oil and the resin of summer-strained trees. The night held a kind of civil attention, the kind cities muster when they decide to be polite to curious strangers. I told her I'd leave her a number if anything came unstuck, and she flexed her fingers with a small, habitual motion and said she would wait until the truck came to make sure the spot was clear. I promised I'd be back. She nodded like that settled the ledger between us. I slid into the driver's seat of my pickup with the couch strapped across the back, and when I started the engine the tailpipe coughed as if approving of being useful. The woman stood on the curb watching as I pulled away. For a long minute I thought I saw the silhouette of someone sitting on the couch through the front window, an arrangement of light and shadow that could have been coat folds or the bend of a shoulder, but by the time I blinked the shape was gone, and when I glanced again she was gone from the doorway too. I told myself she had gone inside to make tea and that my mind was simply inventing company where there had been none. The couch fit into my living room the way a new thing always awkwardly does. I had to rearrange the small furniture, move a lamp, and curse softly at the scratch the frame made against the hardwood. It sunk into my space with a slow, thankful creak and then seemed to settle, as if it had been waiting for exactly the right configuration of light and protein to exist again. That night I slept on the floor beside the couch because there was a faint knot in my chest that felt like obligation. It was easier to sleep where I could see the thing than to wake and discover whatever minor humiliation of a lost sock or misplaced remote I'd be told I owed. I watched the room breathe under the thin lamplight and thought of the woman's eyes, how they had smiled and then tightened in ways the photograph on the mantel might explain. In the small hours, when the city outside turned from a low, indifferent hum to a brittle silence, I heard it, first a soft, almost imperceptible rustle from the couch, then a movement that suggested more than the settling of cotton in springs. It was the sort of sound that invents histories because it arrives between the beats of the ordinary. I sat up and watched the buffer of darkness at the couch's center where the blanket lay. The blanket shivered like something breathing under a thin skin. I told myself this was normal. Old couches make odd noises, houses creak, and people with too much imagination make ghosts where the world is only unfixed. I told myself those stories because telling yourself a narrative you can swallow is a working kind of mercy. But then the glasses that had sat on the arm slid a quarter inch and stopped, as if someone had moved them to see better and then had been distracted. A shadow pooled where the arm met the cushion, too clean, too definite to be cast by the lamp, and for the length of one heartbeat it looked like the outline of a cheek pressed into fabric. It was subtle, and if you blinked fast enough you'd have missed it completely, and human rationality loves blinked moments because they can brazenly claim the next morning they never happened. I waited and watched until a small sense of duty folded me open and I reached out, because you reach for things in your life that you think of as fragile or private to show you are polite in a way the world understands. My fingers touched the blanket and found warmth, as though a body had been there and had just up and left. The next day small people things began to happen, evidence that made sense if you preferred sentences with polite endings. My coffee cup, left the night before beside the couch, was moved to the far table and placed upside down. A newspaper I had not read was folded and set neatly on the arm. When I asked the neighbor, a woman from 2 floors down who liked to borrow sugar and keep long, practical silence, she paused and said, "That couch has a way of making people tidy." She shrugged like a person describing a quirk of weather. I laughed, the laugh that people use when they want to deny something without sounding like a liar. Yet the small unease threaded through me like a fine wire. There was a pattern forming of tiny domesticities settled in the night, gestures that implied presence and required an audience. I tried doing the adult thing, rearranging cushions, airing out fabrics, leaving a record of occupancy by placing a jacket on the back, and each morning the room would be adjusted back to a polite order the couch preferred, as if the furniture had a taste for composition and felt affronted by my amateur attempts at living. On the 3rd night I woke to the sound of someone humming, soft, tuneful, under the blanket. The way people hum when they pass time in the dim and do not want to announce themselves to the whole house. It was an old song, a family tune maybe, one of those maddeningly sweet progressions that lodge in your mind and refuse to leave. The sound made the hairs on my forearms stand up because it carried the intimacy of a lullaby sung by someone who had the idea of you in mind. I went to touch the blanket and this time my hand met resistance, warmth and a small, slow movement that suggested an arm curling beneath the fabric. I held my breath and felt something move against my palm, not coarse or animal but the meticulous pressure of a human hand settling into a space. The humming stopped when I whispered the question, I don't know why I whispered, maybe so the house would not be rude, and the blanket smoothed as if apologetic. I wanted, in that odd instant, to be kind. I wanted to fold the possibility of this otherness into a neighborly concept we could both tolerate. I spoke aloud, softly, "Do you want some tea?" which is an absurd politeness to offer to an object, and maybe because politeness is a ritual the world sometimes answers, the blanket twitched like a nod. When people are not sure of what kindness begets, they test it. I made tea in the morning and set 2 cups on the small table, one for me and one across from me, as if whoever had used the couch once could consider joining my small domesticity. The cup I set across from me remained untouched through breakfast and into the day. But in the late afternoon, when I returned from a mandatory shift at work, I found the 2nd cup empty and set slightly sideways as if someone had taken one cautious sip and then decided they preferred standing to sitting. I could have described this as coincidence or a neighbor playing a joke. But the afternoon's light slanted against the mantel and caught the photograph on the shelf, a young man sitting on that very couch, the same shape now folded into fabric, his eyes looking past the camera at something the picture didn't bother to explain. The woman from the house I'd taken the couch from had come by once more that week to check that everything was still fine. She stood in the doorway and said only that he had been a quiet one and that couches keep the shape of what sits on them. Her face was fixed in an easy kindness that hid something like fatigue. She patted the arm of my couch the way people pat the shoulder of a presence they both know and won't name. A neighbor's cat took to sleeping on the cushion nearest the blanket, and where he lay the fabric warmed and then cooled as if a cycle of occupancy continued its slow, small economy. On the 4th night the humming returned, richer, and this time there was the faint outline of a voice speaking a name, not mine, not anyone I recognized, an old family name that sounded like a rattle and an address strung together. It was not malicious. It was not even sad. It was domestic, a roll call of small details. Did you feed the cat? Did you pick up the milk? Did you remember the name that was left under the cushion? The questions were the kind people ask each other when they assume all of you will show up to the table. I answered aloud because I did not like the idea of motifs left unresolved. I said, yes, and then added a ridiculous explanation that felt both brave and foolish. No, I didn't move anything. I'm keeping watch. The voice hummed like acknowledgement, a sound I read as consent. There came a night when being kind started to feel like a business you did not understand the tariffs of. I woke to the taste of iron in my mouth and the lamp showing fog in the air as if something had been smoking quietly in the living room. The blanket lay folded, and the cushion near it had been turned inward so the indentation faced the floor like a palm hiding a coin. On the coffee table sat an object I did not recognize, a small, tarnished key with a tag tied to it in twine. On the tag someone had written a single line in cramped, careful handwriting, "Remember me." I had not put the key there. I turned it over in my hand and felt the ridges of some other person's life, cold metal worn smooth by pockets, the nick where it had caught on a doorframe, the soft abrasion that comes from being used to unlock the same space until the world expects you to return. The key was not for anything I owned. It wasn't for my building. It belonged to some other architecture entirely, and the thought of that made the room bend inward. It took me a week to understand what the key asked of me. Presence, it turned out, is a strange sort of currency. If you give your attention to something that has lived, sometimes the life within it resettles in your space and charges for the courtesy. I began to notice what was missing in my days, little facts that faded like old ink. The name of the barista who always spelled my name wrong slipped from my mind for an afternoon and returned a humbler version, a line from a song I liked blurred at the edges until I had to hum it back in to remember it. When I told myself that memory is fallible and the human brain is porous with age and stress, the loss felt tolerable. But when I found, tucked under the couch's dust skirt, a photograph of my childhood backyard I had never seen before, edges browned, the faces in it obscured as if someone had smudged the features with fingers, something inside me understood the transaction was not proportionate. The photograph was not merely found, it had been placed, and it had my name written behind it in a looping script I didn't recognize, for keeping watch. There are bargains that start as small courtesies and end in ledger entries. I began to keep lists, the things I saw arranged in the morning, the minor things that took a day or two to wash back into place, the facts that slipped from my memory as if the couch paid them in installments. I left keys, bills, photocopies of receipts as counterweights, leaving the house a small audit of attention. The couch continued its polite, stubborn life. It accepted tea, lent posture to guests, held the weight of my body when I slept on the floor from insomnia or obligation. The woman who'd handed it to me stopped by sometimes, each visit thin as a page turned, and she never asked for the key back. She would stand and watch me straighten the cushions and once asked casually whether I'd noticed anything odd. When I said yes, because I hadn't the courage to lie, she nodded as if to say she had expected as much, then said, "You're doing them a favor." I wanted to ask who she meant by them, but the words stuck behind my teeth like a bird trapped in a jar. Weeks blurred on. Sometimes the life around the couch felt harmless. An old dog that once belonged to a neighbor wandered in and slept and dreamed in quiet, the couch smelling of warm fur afterward. Other times the house pressed outward with small demands, the loss of a friend's birthday detail, the inability to remember a phone number when it mattered. The ledger of tiny absences piled up like unread mail. There came a night when the curtain twitched as if fingers had been combing it back and the lamp clicked off without anyone touching the switch. I lit a candle and felt ridiculous but steady. The flame made the blanket look like a small island in the dark and threw the photograph on the mantel into relief. In the candlelight I made out a name on the photo corner, the same looping script as before: keep watch, keep them tidy, keep a place for what is not gone yet. The handwriting was not mine. It did not match the woman's, it matched the couch's patience. I kept the couch, I kept the key, I kept the photograph tucked into the back of a book that I read when I needed to convince myself I was an adult. I am not sure whether I kept them out of superstition, duty, or a slow sympathy for whatever ledger had been opened in the exchange. Sometimes at night when the city is a muffled thing and the living have gone to their own rooms, I hear the soft rearranging of fabric and the small, polite sounds of company, the hum, the soft settling, the tiny coordination of objects that have found their companions. And sometimes, very late, I speak aloud the names I think I might lose, the ones I want anchored in my head, and the house answers with a patient rustle, as if acknowledging it has recorded them down and will tend to their place for a while longer. Maybe that is cruelty, maybe it is a kindness with a price. Either way, it is a bill I chose to accept the night I drove away from the elm lot with something that looked like a couch and felt, almost immediately, like a small living thing asking to be let in. I took the pet-sitting job because my rent had outgrown my paycheck in the slow, creeping way mold grows along unlit corners, and Craigslist had become a kind of lifeline I didn't want anyone to know I was holding on to. The listing was plain, practical, almost too casual to think twice about. 1 cat, 1 night, $200, need someone comfortable being alone in older houses, please don't mind creaks. It sounded like the kind of gig written by someone elderly and polite, someone who maybe hadn't kept up with market rates and thought $200 for a night was generous rather than suspicious. The address was in a quiet old neighborhood near the river where the houses looked like they had once been important and had since learned to keep their stories folded inside brick walls like old letters. I biked there at dusk, the February cold turning the air sharp enough to taste and the street lamps waking in slow amber blooms. The house was a tall, narrow Victorian pressed between two wider, more renovated homes, its porch sagging slightly as if tired of waiting for someone who didn't come home anymore. The steps groaned politely when I climbed them, and a wind chime near the door tinkled with an almost embarrassed softness, like it didn't want to draw attention. The woman who answered the door had a face with the kind of careful lines people earn from squinting at small details over long years, maybe an archivist, maybe a librarian, maybe one of those old-fashioned schoolteachers who collect silver spoons and keep the good china hidden. Her smile was thin but warm in its way, the type of expression that asked for trust but didn't assume it. "You must be the sitter," she said, and her voice sounded like it came from a different decade, an older, more analog frequency. She guided me inside without touching me, her gestures economical and tidy, and the house smelled faintly of lavender, dust, and something metallic underneath, like the ghost of old construction work. The hallway was narrow, lined with framed botanical prints whose glass reflected the porch light like tiny locked windows. "His name is Bram," she said as she handed me a small sheet of handwritten notes. "He's shy, he likes routine. Please feed him at 10, and don't open the door at the end of the upstairs hall. It doesn't shut well in the cold drafts." She smiled as if this explanation satisfied both of us, though something in the phrasing, "don't open the door," sat oddly on my shoulders like a reminder slipped into a confession. The cat, Bram, was a gray ragdoll with eyes that had that old soul heaviness some animals carry, the kind that makes you think they've lived more lives inside their fur than you've lived in your bones. He watched me from the stairs with a steady patience, his tail flicking slowly as if measuring my usefulness. The woman walked me through the house, kitchen, bathroom, guest room where I'd stay, and each room felt lined with a silence that had its own temperature. Upstairs, the hallway was long and slightly curved with age, the wallpaper peeling in places like it was trying to whisper its original pattern. At the far end of that hall, exactly where the house narrowed toward the back, was a dark wooden door with a tarnished brass handle, its frame slightly crooked. She didn't point to it, she just paused near it long enough that I felt the pause rather than saw it. Then she said again, lightly but deliberately, "Don't open that one." She left shortly after, stepping into the evening with the brisk confidence of someone who has made peace with their routines. I locked the door behind her, fed Bram a small handful of his food, and wandered the downstairs rooms with that full ownership you get in houses you're being trusted with. The kitchen clock ticked in an unusually slow rhythm, each second landing like a soft tap on a hollow surface. The windows gave me a view of a backyard full of brittle winter plants, and a shed leaned slightly to one side like it was bowing under the weight of forgotten gardening tools. The place wasn't creepy, not in the obvious horror movie sense. It was simply old in the way things are old when they've outlasted the people who were supposed to care for them. Bram followed me softly, tail grazing the walls, paws making no sound. Every time I approached the stairs, he paused, sat down, and stared at the upper hallway like it was a threshold he understood better than I did. At around 9, the house began to settle. You know the sounds, wood adjusting, pipes shivering, heaters clicking on, but these sounded slightly too measured, as if the house were performing them, reciting them from memory. I made tea in the kitchen and tried to ignore the feeling that the rooms were staging themselves around me, rearranging in tiny increments to make space. Bram hopped onto the armchair and curled into himself in a way that left one eye half open, watching something I couldn't see. When the clock clicked toward 10, I fed him again, washed the bowl, and stood at the bottom of the stairs for longer than necessary, feeling that quiet invitation houses sometimes extend when you're the only living thing in them. The upstairs landing felt colder than downstairs, not dramatically so, just enough that my skin tightened. The hallway light flickered once, brightened, then steadied like a breath held and released. The long stretch of wallpaper glowed faintly, the floral pattern more vivid in that dim pool of light, and at the far end, the door the woman had warned me about looked still in a way that felt intentional. Not threatening, just aware. I walked down the hall slowly, and the floor beneath me creaked, 3 short notes, then one long one, a rhythm that sounded like it had been practiced. When I reached the last door, I didn't touch it, I didn't need to. The brass handle twitched. Barely perceptible, as if adjusting its position after being held for too long. A draft slipped from under the door and brushed my ankles, cold and strangely directional, like fingers dragging lightly across skin. Bram meowed behind me from halfway down the hall, a sharp, almost scolding sound, and when I turned, he bolted downstairs as though annoyed I'd gone too close. I told myself not to be dramatic, people have strange rooms, old houses have stranger air currents. I returned to the guest room, closed the door, and arranged my bag near the bed. The mattress was softer than expected, dipping slightly in the center like someone had slept there every night for a decade. I switched off the light and lay in the dark listening to Bram's distant pacing downstairs. The house made its noises, slow breaths, small groans, the sigh of temperature shifts, but threaded among them was something different. A faint tap, then another, slow as dripping water. Coming from upstairs, coming from the very end of the hall. I told myself houses talk, I told myself to grow up, I told myself this was a job, and eventually I slept. I woke at 3:14 a.m. because the quiet had changed shape. I didn't hear anything at first, that was the problem. The house had gone silent in that thick, padded way that makes your heartbeat sound louder than it should. Bram wasn't moving, the clock downstairs wasn't ticking, the air had that held-breath stillness that happens right before thunderstorms. I sat up slowly, listening, at first nothing. Then, tap, a single, polite tap, almost apologetic, from the end of the upstairs hall. Then a second tap, softer, like someone correcting the first. I felt the room shift around me, the air thinner now, stretched like a sheet. I opened the guest room door in a careful, reluctant movement, and the hallway beyond was dark except for the faint glow of the nightlight in the bathroom. The draft came first, cold, narrow, deliberate, sliding across my feet like someone passing by me and brushing the edge of my skin. Then the tap came again, not from the door, but from inside the hall itself, close, closer than before. I stepped backward because fear has choreography, and that was when I saw it. The floral wallpaper near the forbidden door was peeling more than before, curling outward as though something had pressed against it from the inside. A thin line of darkness edged out beneath the door, not shadow, not light being blocked, something else, like air that didn't belong to this house trying to slip into it. Okay, I whispered to myself, as if narrating could anchor me. Okay, fine. I walked downstairs, each step amplified, my breath shaking just enough that Bram raised his head from the couch and blinked at me with slow disapproval. I sat beside him because survival makes you childish, you seek fur, warmth, purring things. I stroked his head. He pressed into my hand once, then turned toward the stairs, his ears stiff, listening, waiting. The house resumed breathing around us. A heater clicked, pipes murmured, but the upstairs stayed hushed, too hushed, like a room where someone has asked for silence. I must have sat there for an hour, maybe more. Eventually Bram curled against my leg and slept, and the house softened into something almost normal. Almost. When morning finally bled into the windows, I dared to go upstairs again, sunlight giving me that false bravery we all rely on. The hallway floor creaked the same rhythm as before. The forbidden door sat quietly, handle tilted downward as though someone had held it during the night. The wallpaper near it looked slightly different, smoother now, as if pressed back into place by a careful hand. Nothing strange, nothing overt, except near the doorframe, where a single small scrap of paper lay folded twice. I picked it up because of course I did, and the handwriting inside was tight and deliberate. Please don't let her close it again. My heartbeat stuttered once, harshly. The handwriting wasn't the woman's. It wasn't mine, and the word, her, sat heavily, like a name not spoken. I didn't open the door, I didn't touch it, I fed Bram, washed the bowl, and sat at the kitchen table counting the hours until she'd return. At exactly noon the front door opened, and she stepped inside with the composed briskness of someone who had rehearsed gratitude. I hope everything went smoothly, she said, and her eyes flicked upstairs for a fraction of a second too long, checking, measuring, fearing. I handed her the notes, mentioned the taps only lightly, the way tenants complain about pipes. She smiled with her mouth but not with her eyes. "Old houses," she said softly, "they remember." As I put on my jacket to leave, Bram brushed against my ankle once, lightly, in a way that felt like acknowledgement. Or warning, or both. The woman handed me the cash, thanked me, and I stepped out onto the porch, the winter air feeling more real than anything inside the house had. I walked down the street trying not to think about the folded scrap in my pocket, the one with the request I didn't understand. I haven't gone back. I haven't taken another Craigslist pet-sitting job. But some nights, when the building I live in goes still and the radiator makes its old metal sigh, I hear taps in the hallway outside my apartment, a polite, patient rhythm. Not asking for help, not asking for fear, just asking for a door. And every time I hear it, I think about that room at the end of the upstairs hall, the one the woman didn't want opened, the one someone inside begged me not to let her close. Because doors don't stay shut forever. Especially the ones that remember you. I told myself I'd forget the house, forget the hallway, forget the way Bram's eyes had followed the upper landing like a student watching a closed classroom door. But forgetting is a muscle that doesn't respond on command, and the more I tried to let the details dissolve, the more they arranged themselves into a kind of private architecture in my mind. The shape of that upstairs door lived behind my eyelids like an afterimage, its crooked frame replaying itself each time the lights in my own apartment flickered from the cheap wiring. I could see the wallpaper's floral pattern even in the dark, the way it curled back from the plaster like a breath, and sometimes, if I woke between dreams, I swore I felt that same thin draft slide across the blankets as if something cold had traveled all the way from that old Victorian hallway to check whether I was still listening. The scrap of paper with the message, "Please don't let her close it again," became an object I carried without meaning to. I'd find it in my jacket pocket even when I thought I'd left it in a drawer. Once I unfolded it and the handwriting looked slightly changed, as if the loops had relaxed or tightened depending on whether I had been thinking of the house that day. Another time, I swear the paper felt warm, like it had been held by someone else moments before I touched it, the warmth lingering like borrowed breath. I told myself paper doesn't change, ink doesn't shift, people misremember. But the denial felt brittle, half-hearted, like something trying too hard not to be frightened. 2 weeks passed before I allowed myself to walk past that street again, telling myself I was just taking a different way home, stretching my legs. The house looked the same in the winter light, lean, thoughtful, older than its neighbors in a way that made it seem more patient than they were. The curtains were drawn as before, but the upstairs window on the right was open a sliver, just enough to let out a thread of cold air that drifted into the street. Houses don't breathe, I told myself, houses don't watch. Yet I felt watched in a calm, polite way, like the house had recognized me and was acknowledging the memory of what we shared in its quiet interior. A movement caught my eye near the porch, Bram, sitting as if he'd been waiting. He stared at me with that same heavy-eyed intelligence, tail resting neatly around his paws. Cats belong where they want, not where they're placed, and yet the sight of him outside made my stomach tighten. I crouched down and whispered his name, and he blinked once, slowly, with a kind of resigned affection. Then he looked up toward the second floor, toward the very corner where the forbidden door lived. His ears twitched. His fur shivered once. And he walked away, not toward me, not toward the street, but around the side of the house, slow and deliberate, as if tracing a route he had memorized long before I ever came. I followed, not because I wanted to but because a part of me felt obligated, summoned by the memory of the whispered taps at 3:14 a.m. The backyard looked even more brittle than before, winter vines clinging to the fence like old fingerprints. The shed leaned harder now, its angle more pronounced, as if time had taken one more small bite out of its structure. Bram slipped behind the shed, and when I reached the corner, he was sitting beside a small cellar door built into the ground, its iron latch rusted but not sealed. A faint line of cold air seeped out from beneath it, as if the earth below was breathing slower, deeper, older. Bram looked at me, then at the latch, then back at me again, his gaze steady, insistent. I knelt, my hands shaking, not from the cold but from an understanding I didn't want. The cellar wasn't locked, it wasn't jammed, it wasn't stuck by weather or age. The latch had been opened recently, cleanly, deliberately, quietly. I didn't lift it, I didn't need another doorway in my life that remembered me too well. But I leaned close enough to see the faintest trace of light flickering below, not candlelight, not a bulb, something softer, pulsing like a heartbeat held under the floorboards. I whispered, "Not tonight," as if speaking to a person instead of a place, and the flicker dimmed, not disappearing, just settling deeper into the earth. Bram rubbed against my leg once, then trotted back toward the front porch without looking back, his job done, his message delivered. I didn't follow him, I left the yard quietly, carefully, like someone tiptoeing away from a sleeping patient. That night, my apartment felt wrong in the way familiar places feel wrong after returning from a hospital or a wake. Everything was there, unchanged, but something in the geometry of the rooms felt aware of me in a new way. The hallway light flickered in a rhythm that made me think of those taps, soft, polite, slow. I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to the radiator click, to the faint hum of the city outside, waiting for something to shift. And then it came, not a tap, not a draft, but a quiet settling of weight at the end of the bed, as if someone had sat down gently, considering whether to speak. I didn't look up, I didn't move, fear and familiarity created a strange calm. After a moment, the pressure lifted, the air warmed by a small degree, and something brushed the floor like a trailing hem. Not threatening, not demanding, just present. Sleep came in fragments. At some point before morning, I dreamed I was standing in the upstairs hall of the Victorian house again, the wallpaper unpeeled, the light steady, the forbidden door breathing gently like a lung. When I reached for the handle, the door opened inward by itself, and instead of darkness, I saw a small room lit by a single lamp, warm and inviting, with a rocking chair in the corner and a folded blanket draped neatly over it. Someone sat in the chair. Not quite formed, not quite absent, like a memory learning how to reassemble itself. They turned their heads slowly, gently, and even though their face stayed in shadow, I felt a wave of recognition so deep it startled me awake with tears on my cheeks. Morning light made the dream feel distant, but the feeling stayed, a strange mixture of sorrow and patience, like someone waiting for the right moment to tell you something important. I found the scrap of paper by my pillow again, unfolded, the handwriting thicker than before, the words slightly rearranged, as if whoever wrote them was refining the request over time. It now read, "Please don't let her close it again, it's ours." I pressed the paper flat on my nightstand and sat there listening to my own breathing. I didn't understand the message completely, not then, not now, but I understood enough. Whatever lived behind that upstairs door wasn't trying to escape. It wasn't trying to harm, it was trying not to be forgotten, and the woman who owned the house wasn't entirely its keeper, she was its warden. Maybe out of love, maybe out of fear, maybe out of habit. I haven't gone back, but the house hasn't left me. Some nights, when the hallway outside my apartment shifts into that soft winter hush, I hear Bram's small, familiar meow, distant but patient, like he's reminding me that the story isn't finished, just paused. And once, only once, I heard a gentle tap at 3:14 a.m. from the wall beside my bed, a single note, careful, polite. A reminder, request. A door waiting somewhere, quietly breathing. You have been listening to The Whispering Hour. Tonight's tale fades softly, leaving its last light in the quiet corners of your mind. Let the echoes settle. Let the darkness rest. Good night.